Welcome to another episode of Eating at a Meeting. I am coming to you from Savannah, Georgia. Just actually finished attending the International Caterers Association Ascend conference, and I'll get back to that in a couple of weeks probably, but 3 days of fantastic learning with them. But today, and just before I leave Savannah, I am so excited to bring to you my guest today, Dr. Derrell Peel. We're going to talk about beef pricing and should it stay on our menus and how we can do it. Dr. Peel is one of the most trusted voices in the country on cattle and beef markets. He's a Charles Breedlove Professor of Agribusiness at Oklahoma State University and has served as the Extension Livestock Marketing Specialist since 1989. Wow. So for more than 3 decades, Derrell has helped producers and buyers and the media make sense of what's driving beef prices. And that's what we're going to talk about. And from the herd dynamics to the drought, from trade and demand. And back in May, Jay Varga, a caterer, said, beef prices are high, but the demand is still high. So it's really crazy that we're still willing to pay for beef at the prices that we see. So welcome to the show.
Thank you, Tracy. It's great to be here.
This is so fascinating. So, and as I told my guest last week, and I told you before we got in here, economics is not necessarily my thing, but it is supply and demand. And I think it's really important for all of us to understand what we're dealing with here. So You've been doing this since 1989, and I was a junior in college. And you've described the current situation as tight supplies meeting remarkable demand, which I just said. So for an audience of event professionals, not economists, can you walk us through how we got here and what forces have brought the U.S. cattle herd to its smallest level in decades? And actually, I don't even know how many people knew that we were in the smallest herd in decades.
Yeah, well, there's a lot of things going on. And you told me earlier that one of your professors said, if you don't know the answer to an economics question, say supply and demand. And that's what it's going to come down to. But, what we've got is, as you said, we've got this unique situation now where we have extremely tight supplies. So supply fundamentals are very supportive to markets. At the same time, we do have demand. And you have to have both. I mean, that's where prices come from ultimately is, it's not enough to be tight supplies. If nobody wants it, you don't get high prices. If everybody wants it and you don't have, and you have too much supply, it still keeps the prices moderate. So we have this unique situation. And, from the cattle perspective that leads to beef production and the changes that we're seeing in beef production, the industry is inherently cyclical. And there's a long history of that. Basically, the cattle industry in this country has been cyclical. It's about a 10-year cattle cycle. We call it a 10-year cattle cycle. It's not precisely 10 years, but roughly 10-year cycle of inventory changes. And it's been doing that for 140 years. Really, the ranching industry in this country developed in the late 1800s. Think of the cattle drives, the iconic Western environment. But ever since that developed, the industry has been inherently cyclical with these inventory cycles, which are generally self-correcting. They're economically driven. We get a little bit too big, prices go down. We get a little bit too small, and that pushes price. And so it's normally self-correcting. Sometimes, however, there are external factors then that will either exaggerate or sometimes moderate those cycles a little bit. And what has happened this time, to get to the answer to your question, finally, is that we actually had a cyclical peak in cattle inventories in 2019 in this country. We would have had a modest liquidation for normal cyclical reasons, but starting in 2020 and especially 2021 up until even the current time, we've had persistent drought issues in much of the country. And of course, cattle are unique compared to other livestock or other protein, species in that they're outside, they're subject to the weather. We grow cattle in all kinds of environments, but we've had this sort of roving drought conditions over much of the country where cattle are produced. And so that forced us to get smaller. If the weather is not favorable, producers ultimately have to liquidate. And that does two things. When producers have to sell cattle because they run out of feed or water, then in the short run, that actually increases beef production because those animals, or at least the majority of them, typically go to slaughter. So in the short run, a drought can cause a little spike in beef production, but then longer term, you've lost your productive capacity. And we've been liquidating now for several years. And so we're at a point now where we simply can't maintain a level of production relative to the market demand that we have.
Wow.
And so that leads to the record high prices for cattle and ultimately then for record high prices for beef that we're seeing.
So so cyclical, how long, when is a cattle slaughtered? Is there a certain age? Is there a certain time frame in that cycle? Is it a 10-year thing? Like, I'm going to keep a cow till they're 10 and then slaughter it? Or does that not even impact that?
The life cycle of the cow itself, an individual cow, I mean, they are productive for roughly 10 years in their life, but that's not really what's driving the cattle cycle. But part of what is driving the cattle cycle is just recognizing a couple of things about the biology of cattle production. One is that these are large, relatively slow growing animals. So part of the answer to your question in terms of the majority of the beef production in this country comes from young cattle. We do slaughter mature cows. We have to cull them at some point. That's a different piece of the total beef supply. But the majority of what we think of as beef demand or beef products, steaks, and all of the high valued cuts come from relatively young animals that are somewhere in the neighborhood of 18 months of age at the time they are harvested.
Oh, wow.
Okay.
Oh,
so
wow. Okay.
It takes 18 months to get them to that point. And cattle they have a gestation very similar to humans, so about 9 months. So on top of the 18 months, that cow was in gestation for 9 months prior to the birth of that animal. So it's a very long process. It takes a couple of years to get. And then if you have to change the size of the herd, it all depends on having those breeding females. And if you don't have enough of those, it takes another 24 months when you save a female calf that's born. For her to become a cow, it's going to take 2 years to get her to her first calf. And then it's going to be another 18 months or so after that before that calf would be coming out of the system and contributing to beef supplies. So it's a very long process, particularly when you're in a hole, when you're in a limited inventory like we are now. And the other thing that's unique here is that cows have typically one offspring at a time, one calf at a time, about once a year. If everything's on track, a mature cow will have one calf a year. If we don't have enough females in total for the herd, and we need to expand the herd, if that one calf is a female, then we have to pull her out of the current supply chain because we've got to retain her for that 24-month process to get her into production as part of the herd. So there's a one-for-one trade-off between using female cattle for breeding or for feeding, for beef production.
Right. Yeah.
In the short run. So what it means, it's kind of the opposite of the drought effects where you dump cattle on the market and temporarily increase supplies. At the other end of things, when you don't have enough cattle, you have to make a tight supply even tighter for some period of time in order to save enough females and ultimately rebuild production. That's going to be a 3 or 4 year process.
Wow.
And that's where we're at right now because we really haven't started any heifer retention at this point. So we're in very tight supplies, which if we do nothing will continue to get tighter. But if we want to fix it, it's going to get tighter as well for some period of time. And then eventually we would see increased production.
Wow. That's fascinating. You don't think about that. I mean, so a cow has one baby at a time.
Yep,
does she produce more than, do ranchers keep them to do two more or, longer, have more than one baby?
Oh yeah. I mean, a mature cow, typically, again, her productive life will be plus or minus 10 years. So she'll have around 10 calves in her lifetime if she stays productive and healthy and all of that. But again, it was about a 2-year process to get her to the point of having her first calf. And so she'll go till she's 12 or 13 months. It varies a lot. And obviously some cows get culled sooner. Eventually that cow will get old. She won't be productive. She either won't conceive and will not produce a calf, or she will get to the point where physically she's just not able to function. And so those animals then will get culled. They will go into part of the beef supply. They actually supply a lot of the lean beef processing beef, we could call it, that's used for our ground beef market. Ground beef, of course, is a mixture of fat and lean, and we use a variety of different products. But to get enough of that lean, that's where those cull cows really contribute to that part of our beef supply.
And I want to go to, because you said that before we went on air, you told me that there are about 4,000 different products that come from the beef market, which blows my mind because you think steak.
Oh yeah,
yeah.
It's Well, it's many more things. It's more than it's. Yeah. I don't know how many thousand products. I used to throw out the number 20,000, and I've become convinced since then that it's way more than that. Ultimately.
Oh really? Wow.
Oh yeah. What packers produce directly, so what comes out of the primary fabrication process is several thousand products. But then ultimately those products, many of them, particularly, again, products that are going through the food service side of the industry, so that would be all of your institutional and restaurant stuff, those typically go through some further processing, either for portion control or additional processing or whatever. And so ultimately, I don't know, and I'm not sure, I don't think anybody actually knows how many thousands of products the beef industry produces, but it's I don't know, it's at least 30 or 40,000 probably ultimately when you account for everything,
Right. And when we're talking, and just for clarification too, when we're talking the beef market, we're literally talking cows. We're not talking bison. We're not talking other.
Yeah.
We're talking cattle.
No, that's just cattle.
Right?
Yep. Just cattle.
Wow. That's amazing.
It's very complicated. It's very complex.
Yeah. Because you think when you go to the grocery store or you're looking at a catering menu, you're looking at a hamburger, ground beef, or you're looking at a steak or a filet, something you don't think about. And I said tallow before we got online, right? But think about all the protein strips that are now like, oh, I'm going to have a beef jerky right now, right?
Yeah.
All of that.
All of those processed products, come out of that as well. And again, the ground beef market, my estimate is that between 47 and 48% of the total per capita beef consumption in this country is in the form of ground beef. We're quite unique in the world in that we love our hamburger. And that's, that's both for at home. So ground beef, it allows you to decide what supper is going to be 30 minutes before you want to eat. Right. And so it's our go-to. It's usually our most economical product. And it's our go-to flexibility there. But obviously, then if you look at the quick service restaurant side, we consume an enormous amount of ground beef in those places where you drive through and somebody hands you something through a window. And so, so ground beef is an enormously important part of our market. And so, and again, that in and of itself is an entire industry that's extremely complex and very diverse. We learned that during COVID when restaurants closed down and all of the beef demand from half of the market, roughly half of our total beef consumption in this country is away from home and roughly half is at home. So that gives you your food service side and your retail grocery side. And what happened during COVID was we essentially shut down half of the market and shoved all of the beef demand into the other half. That's why for a very brief period of time, grocery stores ran out of beef because everybody was trying to do everything at home. And restaurants had, and many of them had access to products when grocery stores couldn't get access because those supply chains are quite different and quite specialized. And so it took some time. We did eventually get products moving in ways they didn't normally move during that process, but it took some time because those supply chains are typically quite unique and quite specialized.
Yeah, because if you see the food distribution trucks on the road, you don't necessarily know where they're going to the grocery store, if they're going to Publix or if they're going to TGI Fridays, right? Yeah,
exactly. Most of the major food distribution companies, and I'm not going to, if you think of the Cisco types or, whatever, that type of, typically that's mostly oriented towards food service, typically. And then grocery stores are getting their product from a different source. Again, the way they're packaged and presented and so on is very different. Grocery stores typically don't do portion control. So that's why all your steaks in the store, different sizes, different prices, and so on, because they're coming pretty much directly off the carcass in most cases. Whereas, restaurants typically have very specific product specifications for a 6-ounce steak or an 8-ounce steak or whatever it is. And it's cut to a certain thickness and it's a certain quality. Somebody had to do that because one of the things that we've sort of hinted at here, but one of the things you have to keep in mind is that part of what makes the cattle industry and to some extent other protein markets unique is that it's not an assembly. If you think about most manufacturing products, you take a bunch of inputs and you produce one thing to sell. This is a disassembly process. We have a complex input in the form of that live animal, and we're taking that complex input apart into all of these thousands of different products, each of which is in a separate market. That's why it's so tremendously complex to understand this market, is because we're proliferating, one thing into a lot of different products. And so, and as you said, steaks are obvious. Demand is there. Every cow's got steaks in the middle of them, but all of those steaks come with 4 legs attached, and those 4 legs have other things attached to them that we have to find a home for. We have a mix of products that come from every animal that doesn't always exactly match up with what we want to eat in terms of our preferences.
Exactly.
So the market has to sort all that out. Yeah, the market has to sort all that out in terms of finding a home for all those products. And obviously it's perishable. So you don't have an infinite amount of time to do that.
Oh my gosh. So fascinating, because you just think you're sitting down and eating a steak and you don't know where that came from, or vice versa.
Again, before you leave that, if you want to think about the miracle of this market and all the things, if you walk into a grocery store or you sit down in a restaurant, the meat, that steak that you're looking at started with somebody making a decision about 2 to 3 years ago, somewhere a long ways away. And it's gone through multiple hands as a live animal, as well as probably multiple entities through the processing and distribution chain. And yet it's a piece of fresh meat that's probably not more than about 3 weeks away from when it was harvested. It's absolutely a miracle that any of it works if you stop and think about it.
Yeah. That's crazy. All right. We have 2 comments over here on LinkedIn. Diane just said, "This is hitting a nerve with me. Our industry holds enormous buying power and has never exercised any of it. Whether beef prices, availability, or quality, we have not put any pressure on the big meat industry. Think about how much the industry uses daily, from hotels to restaurants. You have created a space for this to grow and develop, and I just trust one day that power will be harnessed to make a difference." And let me put a little bit of context behind what Diane just said too, is that the meetings industry, and this is a number from 2016, spends $46 billion on food and beverage for events of more than 10 people inside the United States, right? And so we have an enormous amount of buying power. And this is not talking food service for schools and everything. This is literally for conventions and hotels and caterers. And why can't we harness that buying power, right? I mean, and I guess it goes to that question, before we started too, before we went live, is and I think it's actually tying into the next question that I want to ask you, is take us into the value chain. When a hotel pays a distributor for a case of strip loins or fillets, how did that price get built from the cow-calf producer through the feedlot, the packer, the distributor? And where are those biggest price steps along the way? And can we as an industry have any impact on that? That was a lot.
That is a lot, and obviously you could teach a semester course on just that.
Right.
But I'll try to make it as simple as possible. I mean, again, it is an enormously complex industry with these multiple layers. And the way I explain it to people is that at the fundamental level, all supply in this industry comes from the cow-calf production. So it's those mama cows out in the pasture. They have one baby a year. And collectively, as an industry, that's what determines everybody else's supply. And so, if you want to think about who controls that, well, it's a very decentralized industry. That's the least aggregated part of the industry because we produce cows everywhere that grass grows, basically. And so we've got
Okay.
cattle production, or cow production in particular, all over the country, and lots of small units. The average herd size in the US is 47 cows. Now
Wow.
they range from 5 or 1 in many cases, all the way to tens of thousands a head in a very small number of very large ranching operations. But the average across the whole industry is 47 cows. So it's very, very decentralized. And then once those calves are produced, typically they get weaned at about 8 months of age. And then they start entering into a very complex marketing and production system that takes those calves, and from a production standpoint, it's going to grow them, sometimes with additional forage-based growth, but ultimately, in most cases, in the feedlot. Obviously, we don't do that with everything, but the majority of cattle will end up going through a feedlot. That's a different entity in a different part of the country. So these cattle are going to change hands at least once or twice to get to that point. And so, and at the same time, they're going to be shipped around the country into larger and larger units, because it's much more efficient as we get to where we're not relying on that dispersed forage base, that grass base. Then by the time they get to the feedlots, they're in relatively large units. And so all that assembly is what we call it economically. That's an economic function. And all the shipping, all the assembly adds to it. And everybody beyond the cow-calf level is a margin operator. And in the sense that the majority of the economics of everybody in this industry, all the way to the final consumer, is about some sort of basic buy-sell margin. And so you have what we call stocker producers that grow cattle. They buy calves and grow them to feeder cattle. Feedlots buy feeder cattle and grow them to fed cattle. Packers buy fed cattle, turn them into box beef. Wholesalers or distributors or further processors buy that box beef and turn it into thousands more different products. But it's almost all the basic economics. Now, there's obviously lots of additional costs and things that go into that.
Right.
But the basic economic of all of those levels is a buy-sell margin. And so what that means is at the end of the day, there's lots and lots of increments to that supply chain and to that value chain. But the proportions of those chains, to answer your question, it changes a bit over time because this industry is cyclical. So right now, for example, because of the tight supplies and record high cattle, the market is trying to tell the primary producers, those cow-calf producers, we need more calves. So a bigger proportion of the total value of that beef product ultimately coming back to the cattle is going to the primary producer right now. At other times, when there's lots of cattle and beef prices are falling and cattle prices are falling, then the margins will shift a little bit to some of the other sectors. And so those margins are quite variable over time. They tend to average out to some level relative to the services provided at each of those levels. But, right now, cow-calf producers are actually enjoying the best returns they've ever seen. And the market is encouraging them to, as a result, expand production. And they will eventually. They just haven't yet. At the same time, some of the other margin levels of this industry are actually struggling a lot because as these prices go up, driven by short supplies from the bottom up, typically all of the margin operations are facing some sort of adverse margin environment. And right now, the worst of that is at the packing level. The packing industry in this country is losing enormous amounts of money right now because they're in a position where they depend on volume to be efficient. They don't have that volume, and they just don't have enough cattle to process. And so that sector is losing enormous amounts of money right now. They won't indefinitely, and eventually it'll come around, and there'll be times when they make a bigger margin, and other sectors will have a smaller margin. It also affects retail and everybody else.
So that I think I asked you this question when I sent you an email that one chef said to me, well, we have our set prices, right, that we've contracted through a group purchasing thing. And so because it's not going to, in one way, he was saying it's not going to impact our prices at the hotel level because we've got these contracts. Those contracts are with the distributors and the packers. And because he said, the ranchers are getting screwed, but it's not really because it's the distributors and the packers based on what you just said. Did I get that right?
And again, at every level, there can be some amount of rigidity in those price adjustments. And I'm not saying that's a bad thing. It makes perfect sense why, everybody along the way would. And so from the retail or from the, final level backwards, you do like stability in your pricing. And so
Right.
there's certainly a lot of it. In fact, generally prices get more rigid the farther up the chain you go.
Okay.
Restaurants don't like changing prices, or, food service people, they do like that consistent, and they need to have that. So, and grocery stores adjust prices when they have to, but they don't necessarily like to. But,
Right.
they do what the market requires. And so what that means is, yeah, you can have one sector that at least for a period of time is insulated from some of this, but it probably means somebody below them is actually getting squeezed unless they also did exactly the same things that needed to be done to protect their margin. And
Right.
at some point in time, there's going to be a squeeze in this thing. And so
Yeah.
it's just a question of what level it's going to fall to. And again, right now it's falling primarily on the packing industry. We're getting a little ahead of maybe, but beef production is going to continue to fall in this country. It's falling in 2026. It's been falling since 2022. That was the peak.
Okay.
In fact, that was an all-time peak in beef production. We've been seeing decreases in beef production. It'll go down in 2026. It'll go down in 2027. And there's a good chance at this point that it might continue falling into 2028 at least.
I mean, it goes back to you saying, so nobody's growing new cows. I mean, they're not really trying to right now. Why not?
There's a bunch of reasons. There's a long list of reasons why ranchers are, they make business decisions. They have to have expectations. Part of it is just the fact that weather was the big driver of why we're smaller than we intended to be. And we still have significant weather challenges. So some producers are either still in drought and they're not able to expand. They may have dropped down to a level that they can hold what they've got, maybe. If the drought gets worse, they might be forced to additional liquidation. But even if they can hold what they've got, they're not able, or depending on uncertainties about weather and La Nina and El Nino and all of that stuff, they may just be unwilling to take the risk of trying to advance to increase production at this point in time, just because of the climatic reasons. So there can be physical reasons why they're not expanding. There's also a tremendous amount of financial questions, and obviously their production costs are driven by a lot of things going on in the macroeconomy: fertilizer prices, fuel prices, interest rates, and all of those things. And so they have to reach a point where they decide the market's offering enough incentive that they will respond. And again, I expect they will, but they have been much slower to do that this time, partly because there's just a myriad of factors that is basically encouraging producers to be cautious and very, very hesitant with the aggressiveness of their production plans.
Okay. All right. Richard Godfrey posted on LinkedIn as well. He goes, I grew up a rancher. I'll pay whatever it takes to protect the ranchers and the quality of U.S. beef. With higher prices, I may eat a little less, but we need to protect domestic supply. And then he's like, and then in a following comment after that, he said, I only eat local or validated small suppliers, which would be like a Will Harris from White Oak Pastures, or the gentleman that I know from Good Ranchers, right? So but I'll just use Will because he's in Georgia, but he's not going to be able to supply a 17,000 person convention at the Georgia World Congress Center in Atlanta, right? Yeah. So where do we, and Will's is a regenerative agriculture rancher, right? So how is regenerative agriculture coming into play with this, helping these ranchers think through what's the future of their ranch, right?
Sure.
Yeah.
Ranching is land-based. That's one of the things that makes it unique. It's very land intensive because cattle are outside. They're big animals. They require a fair amount of resources, if you will. And that depends on where you are. A lot of resources varies a lot whether you get 50 inches of rain a year or 10 inches of rain a year. But it's all relative, right? So the stocking rates and so on adjust. But the point is that, again, we do produce cattle all over the country. There is a need to get those assembled into larger units. Small local focus is perfect for some individuals, some producers. At some scale, but it won't feed the country. Okay, you're not going to feed New York City with just local production that's only a few miles from home. Just can't happen. And
Right.
in fact, there's a lot of balancing goes on between specialized, one of the things that makes beef unique as an agricultural product is that it's not a commodity in the sense that, if you grow wheat, your wheat looks a lot like my wheat. We mix them together and we don't worry usually about identity preservation in general. With cattle, every animal is different. Their quality is different. They get graded. Their genetics are different. And so they're inherently a different product. And yet there's a lot of value in the total beef system for certain parts of the supply chain to utilize large size operations, large scales that capture the economic efficiencies of those large scale operations. And so economies of size is a very real thing that is very important for both, particularly for the feedlot sector as well as for the beef packing sector. And so the reason we have the industry structure we have is to capture those cost efficiencies. And there's always a little bit of a balance between treating animals kind of like a commodity to capture some cost efficiencies and recognizing at the same time that they're actually very different products. And so it's a real challenge. And then it's even worse when not only are the cattle different quality, but we're going to take them apart into thousands of different products that go into different markets that range from retail grocery to food service to exports to you name it. And so it's just an enormously complex process.
It's very mind-boggling. And all right, touching on, because you just said crossing the border and exports, and kind of touching on what Richard said, protecting the U.S. rancher. Is there disruption, and there's a lot of things that I want to say in this thing, disruption with besides the drought, the wars or disease and trade policies, tariffs that we've had on different products from Canada, Mexico to Brazil, where we get meat from too. How is all of that impacting the U.S. product and getting imports from other countries? Is that really hurting our U.S. ranchers?
Yeah. Several things there again. And first of all, I would say that we've been in an extremely volatile, uncertain time that's affected everybody pretty much across the board. But all of this geopolitical stuff, political stuff in the U.S., variable trade policy and all that adds additional uncertainty. I think the uncertainty by itself is taking a toll on the industry to some extent. Again, cattle production by its nature is a long-term process. Producers commit to, multiple decades of production. I mean, just for an individual cow, she's going to be in production for 10 or 12 years. And so that kind of uncertainty takes a toll on the market. And that's one of the other factors that probably explains why we've been slow to respond. There's just so much volatility and uncertainty out there that producers they're kind of hunkered down a little bit relative to being even more aggressive. The trade policy per se, we have for many years both imported and exported beef. Okay. And that's probably one of the most consistent questions I've had for nearly 4 decades is why do we both import and export beef? And the answer, of course, comes back to this idea that beef is not one thing. We talk about beef trade or beef demand. You and I were talking about this earlier. Beef is thousands of different products, and every one of them's in a different market. And because we're disassembling these animals into all the component parts, we don't necessarily like to eat products in the same proportion that they come off the animals. So in order to get steaks, we got to deal with the fact that those steaks come attached to 4 legs. And those legs involve other muscles and other products that we may like less or use for different things or whatever. Trade is just a way for the market to seek out value, which is what it does in every market. I mean, that's what markets do, right, is seek out value. So we export things that we either don't like as much in the U.S. or where there's simply more value in another market. I mean, that's the American way, right? Biggest checkbook wins. Right. At the same time, we import products to supplement supplies in the U.S. where we don't produce enough of the right particular product, and also sometimes to supplement supplies in general. Right now, we are getting record levels of beef imports. And yet we have record prices. It's not hurting the industry in the U.S. In fact, it's adding value to the U.S. because, and a lot of it is driven by the ground beef market.
Okay.
We talked earlier about the importance of ground beef in the U.S., and we could not have the ground beef market in the U.S., whether we're talking consumers at home or fast food consumption or any other market where ground beef is used. We could not have that industry and maintain that part of our beef demand in this country without imported beef. And it actually makes U.S. cattle worth more because we can take the fatty trimmings from our fed cattle and we mix them with lean to make them into ground beef. And if we didn't do that, those fatty trimmings would lose value and it would actually make U.S. cattle production worth less.
Interesting. So, but made in the USA, I mean, we're pushing made in the USA, right? And I know that we have to put place of origin on a variety of different products, food products, right? And I remember seeing a bag of green beans that came from 4 different countries to make one bag of green beans. But same thing with the meats. I mean, the place of origin. So it kind of is a mixed bag here of like, we want made in the USA, but to make our USA products more valuable, we need the imports.
What we have gotten to at this point in the U.S. is we have for beef, is we have the made in the USA label, which is very specific now to qualify for that label, but it's voluntary. And, so you don't have to use it. And of course, there's a long history of proposals for mandatory country of origin labeling in the industry and so on. And, those, I was going to say, I lost my train of thought there for a second.
I do that all the time.
I do. Yeah. Sorry. Those proposals don't recognize in many cases that the value to the industry comes from having both. Okay. And so, again, I spend a lot of time explaining to producers and others why trade is not a scary thing. It's not something we should worry about. It actually makes us better off. One of the things to think about is to the extent that a beef carcass produces products that we don't like as much. So there's things that we just don't eat as much, right? And I'm not just talking offals or tongues and livers and that kind of thing, but there's other parts of the animal that we don't. It's kind of like people who put a half a beef in the freezer. If you want to do the local beef thing, you put a half a beef in the freezer. Well, if you get a full half a beef, there's going to be some of those products that are still going to be in the bottom of the freezer when most everything else is gone. And we will eventually eat them, but they're not our first choice. And the thing is, if we can export those products to another country where they maybe even have more value than they do here because we don't like them as much, not only does it help out in that sense, it adds value to the industry, but we don't need to eat them here. It's a perishable product, which means that we can actually go buy the stuff we want to eat the most and spend more money. Okay. And so you actually enhance domestic demand when you use trade, and it's true for both imports and exports, to actually streamline or I don't want to say specialize the supply of beef products to better match the preferences of consumers in the U.S. And so when we import, much of what we import from wherever it comes from, it does vary a little bit by country, but most of the majority of the imports that we get are this lean processing beef. We use it to help make ground beef. And if we didn't do that, we either would have a much smaller ground beef industry in the U.S., and so we would lose that value to the beef industry. And again, it's almost half of our total beef consumption.
Wow. Okay. So there's so much to unpack here. It's mind-boggling. And it's so interesting. All right. I want to take it back a little bit to like a hotel, and a meeting planner trying to design a menu, or what cuts and what types of products right now are under the most price pressure. If we've already talked about this, just you need to put it back in layman terms for me here, right. And what does that mean for someone designing a banquet menu, or how can catering chefs, what would you tell them about time selection and diversifying their products? I mean, should we be serving flank steaks instead of fillets, or should we be serving, over the next couple of years? How does a meeting planner and a hotelier kind of make those decisions based on what we are currently in?
And again, I already indicated earlier in terms of my forecast, I guess, is that beef production will continue to decline in the U.S. So all of these supplies are going to be tighter, and the prices for whatever product at relatively high levels. And so it's all going to be kind of relative. But at some level, whether you're a caterer or a restaurant or a grocery store, it comes down to not just, it comes down to sort of plate cost or portion cost or package cost if it's a grocery store. And so in order to try to control that, obviously you're talking about perhaps utilizing some, if you start with tenderloins as the highest valued product, ribeyes are right behind them usually. But then you get into, strip loins are pretty close. But then you get into flank steak and top sirloin and, some of those kind of products. And so there's not a magic solution. There's no answer here in that there's any big hole or any big place to go to. It's going to come down to individual needs, but there probably in general will be more need to consider some of those mid-level products relative to maybe the top end. One of the things we haven't talked about, and we probably just have a little bit of time here, but I'll quickly mention, one of the challenges in this industry, and it's particularly true perhaps for your audience here, is the fact that cattle numbers are down right now, but carcass weights are up. We're feeding cattle longer and making them bigger, which does help offset the supply pressure a little bit. But at the same time, bigger cattle means bigger muscles, which means bigger cuts. And so there's been an inherent kind of trade-off for 20 or more years in this industry where the economic efficiencies of producing cattle pushes us to make them bigger, but consumers haven't really been asking for bigger steaks for about 25 years. Right. No. And so one of the things we have to do is we're doing more additional fabrication. And so, and again, you're very aware of this, more so than I am probably, but you start looking at, the first step would be to take, pull the spinalis muscle off a ribeye and do a center cut. Or you might do that with some other products as well. But then, from a particularly a catering standpoint or whatever, it probably comes down to, you don't get a whole steak, you get a slice of a steak. And we're seeing that more and more. There was a time when I didn't think that would ever happen, that we would take a ribeye or something like that and serve it as less than a whole muscle cut. Obviously, white tablecloth restaurants are the last to change. They don't want to change the way that looks. It takes a lot of mashed potatoes or green beans or carrots to lay next to that cut edge to make it look a little more appealing relative to what we've been used to. But we're seeing more and more that we're doing more of this additional fabrication. Now, the additional fabrication, that's coming out of the further processing sector. That's part of your portion control kinds of stuff. And obviously that adds more cost. That's something else somebody's got to do. And it creates more products. I told you earlier, every time you take a knife to a piece of meat, you turn one product into two. And so, and it's going to get used. So, that's part of the challenge of the industry is if we're going to make one piece of it, and then what do you do with the rest of it? And so you're looking for a home for that and finding some other market. But I say all that to say that I think, one of the things the catering industry may be looking at is more and more of this additional fabrication in terms of sizing products to maintain portion cost or plate cost. I think that's going to be an increasing challenge. Again, we've changed this industry tremendously. We don't produce hardly any select beef anymore. We're producing almost 90%, 88% of our beef production today is either choice or prime. And prime has never been this big. So there's a lot more prime beef. There's more choice relative to 15 years ago or something. And so there's some ability to switch between qualities if that's feasible. But obviously it depends on the market, depends on the situation.
And one final question before I wrap this up, when does price finally start to change behavior? I mean, is there a true answer to that? And in last week when we were talking about, supply and demand, the prices are not really going to come back down. I'm like, we're paying what we're paying, and will they continue to just go up?
Again, the beef market being as sort of cyclical as it is, there will come a time when we will see some moderation of these beef prices. It's probably the end of the decade at this point before that's going to happen.
Wow. Okay.
But there will, just from a supply standpoint, because the industry eventually, we never come down in terms of nominal prices, we never go back to where we were before. So they're probably going to stay at a higher level, but they will back off of these high prices. Again, very common question I get is that people want to know, when do we lose beef demand? Well, you don't ever totally lose beef demand. As the question posed earlier, it gets high. Maybe I eat a little bit less. Other people eat less. Some people might get priced out of the market at some level, but we ration tighter supplies with higher prices. So I don't see lower prices happening anytime soon in the beef industry. There doesn't, the only thing that could really bring prices down in the face of the supply situation that we're in and will be in for much of the rest of the decade would be just an absolute crash in consumers. We basically have to have a recession or something macroeconomically, where economists define demand as the willingness and ability to purchase products. And the willingness is clearly there. The preferences are there. Demand has been very robust. So it would take some sort of macroeconomic crash that just absolutely forced consumers to make drastic changes. And if that happens, frankly, we're going to be much worried about a lot of other things besides beef prices. It would have to be that bad in terms of a macroeconomic problem. So we're going to continue to struggle with high prices. We're going to ration tighter supplies. But at the same time, beef demand has just been phenomenal. Yeah. And I don't see that changing unless we had something like this macroeconomic problem that was, and I just don't see that happening either. I mean, I don't think it's likely to happen, but that would be the only thing I can think of that realistically could make prices come down. And so we are where we are. Now, someday we will increase production and it will pull prices down relative to some other things at that point. Right. But it's going to be a lengthy process at this point.
All right. Yeah. And thank you. I mean, I'm blown away by everything that goes into this, right? And there's so many pieces. Like when I talk about an event and there's the person that's eating it, and then all the people, the event planner, the hotel manager, the chef, the sous chefs, the server. I mean, there's all of that, plus that, what you just described in just getting that steak to the plate.
That's right.
Or that hamburger to the plate. And we have to think through, and everybody needs to make money along the way. Because they're all doing
everybody does, but at the same time, there's just a lot of mouths to feed in this system. Sometimes people sort of start out looking for who's abusing the system, who's messing with the system. There's no indication that anybody anywhere in this industry is not working for a living. It's just that it's an enormously complex industry. As I explained to you, or I suggested to you earlier, I think it's the most complex set of markets on the planet. When you consider all of the production diversity, the perishability, it's just, and then the product, the disassembly into thousands of different products. It's an industry that's unparalleled in the amount of complexity that goes into all of this.
Wow. Well, thank you so much for spending time. I have a couple of quick questions for you. Rapid fire.
Okay.
What is your best beef dish you've ever eaten, and where were you when you ate it?
Oh my gosh. Yeah, you should have given me a little warning. I've had the luxury of eating beef in lots of different places around the country as well as out of the country. And, at the end of the day, to pick a single experience that was the best would be difficult for me. And I'm a beef eater, so I eat all of it. I mean, I guess on a day in and day out basis, all else being equal, I'm probably a ribeye guy as much as anything. Okay. So that's probably where I tend to go to.
All right. And in your work, where has been your favorite place, U.S. or abroad, taken you?
Oh, man. Again, that's a difficult one to answer because I've enjoyed learning about this industry and all of the ways that it works. If you think about raising cattle everywhere from the Everglades in Florida to subalpine regions of Colorado or Montana and everywhere in between, it's fascinating to learn how this industry works in lots of different environments. I have to tell you, and we didn't talk about this, but among other things, I have worked in Mexico for about 35 years. I've been going down there. I lived down there for a year at one point, about 25 years ago, on sabbatical. And so there's lots of places I like and all of that, but I really do have a big affinity for Mexico and the Mexican culture.
Okay, awesome. And if you weren't doing this, what would you be doing?
Boy, I can't imagine. Somebody asked me that the other day, too. I'm a farm boy. I grew up on a farm raising a few cattle. And I still think of myself as a farm boy. I'm amazed that I have anything to offer anybody. I'm just delighted to visit with people and learn and continue learning. But, so I'd probably be in agriculture, perhaps in a more production environment. Although at this point, I'm getting a little past the rodeo cowboy stage, so I probably wouldn't go back and do too much of that. But yeah, something like that, I suppose. That's what I started out as before I discovered I was an economist.
Oh, wow. Okay. You can wrap or I don't even remember the term, like you can, whatever that word is, never mind.
Yeah.
All right. And then last question, finish this sentence. Every meal should
be a very enjoyable experience.
Okay. All right. That works. That's simple enough. It should, right? With what you're eating and who you're sitting with, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, if anybody wants to get in touch with you and find out more, how can they get in touch with you?
It's not very hard to find me anymore, but my email is derrell.peel@okstate.edu. You're welcome to get a hold of me. I have charts and I write a weekly newsletter along with some animal science producers. It's oriented towards cattle producers, but I talk about a little bit of everything. So sometimes I cover meat markets, I cover international trade, all this stuff. And so if you would be interested in getting, it's a free weekly newsletter. I've written it for about 20 years. So I'm up around 1,000 articles I've written over time. So Derrell.Peel, Derrell is DERRELL.PEEL @okstate.edu. And you can just tell me you are interested in the newsletter and I can put you on the list to get that.
Fantastic. Thank you so much.
You're very welcome. I've enjoyed it very much.
Good. I have learned a lot. I am so blown away by what it takes to get that steak on the plate or a hamburger on the plate, whatever it is. But thank you so much for spending time with us. And I look forward to staying in touch.
Absolutely. Anytime. Okay. I'd be happy to follow up. And if you have questions, anybody has questions, I'm happy to take those.
Okay, great. Thank you, Derrell.
Yeah.
Everybody, same time, same place next week. I will let you know who my guest is in a few days. We'll talk. And until then, stay safe and eat well. Thanks. Thanks for listening to the Eating at a Meeting podcast, where every meal matters. I'm Tracy Stuckrath, your food and beverage inclusion expert. Call me and let's get started right now on creating safe and inclusive food and beverage experiences for your customers, your employees, and your communities. Share the podcast with your friends and colleagues at our Eating at a Meeting Facebook page and on all podcast platforms. To learn more about me and receive valuable information, go to tracystuckrath.com. And if you'd like more information on how to feed engagement, nourish inclusion, and bolster your bottom line, then visit eatingatameeting.com.